As the first light of dawn spreads across the vast Atlantic Ocean, the sea appears calm, endless, and almost timeless. Gentle waves shimmer beneath the rising sun, hiding a secret that has rested in silence for more than a century. Far below the surface, nearly 4,000 meters beneath the water, lies the wreck of the RMS Titanic. Once celebrated as the greatest passenger ship ever built, it now rests in complete darkness, surrounded only by drifting currents and the quiet mysteries of the deep. It is hard to imagine that this peaceful place was once the scene of one of history's most unforgettable tragedies. Hello, and welcome back to Chill and Feel Chronicles. We're so glad you've joined us for another relaxing journey into the past. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? Share your answer in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see people from around the world exploring history together. And if you enjoy these calm historical adventures, don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss another voyage through the stories that shaped our world. Now imagine this for a moment. What if the safest ship ever built was doomed before it even left the harbor? What really happened during the final 2 hours and 40 minutes of Titanic's tragic voyage? And why does the world still refuse to let this extraordinary story sink into history? The Titanic was far more than a luxury ocean liner. It became the ultimate symbol of the industrial age, a masterpiece of engineering, ambition, and human confidence. Every detail of the ship reflected a belief that technology could conquer nature itself. People called her magnificent, revolutionary, and even unsinkable. Yet on one freezing April night in 1912, everything changed. In just a few short hours, the world's greatest ship disappeared beneath the icy Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 lives with it, and leaving behind questions that continue to fascinate generations. Tonight, we'll retrace that remarkable journey, from its grand construction and glamorous passengers to its heartbreaking final moments, and discover why the legend of the Titanic still captures our imagination more than a century later. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was changing faster than ever before. Across Europe and North America, factories filled the skies with smoke, railways stretched across entire continents, and new inventions transformed everyday life. The Industrial Revolution had turned nations into economic powerhouses, creating an age of remarkable confidence in science, engineering, and human progress. Every year, bridges grew longer, buildings climbed higher, and machines became more powerful. It seemed as though there was no challenge that technology could not overcome. This was also an era defined by movement. Millions of people dreamed of a new beginning across the Atlantic Ocean. Families left behind crowded cities, struggling farms, and uncertain futures in search of opportunity in the United States and Canada. Some hoped to escape poverty, while others fled political unrest or simply longed for a better life. Steamships became the bridges between two worlds, carrying not only passengers, but also hopes, ambitions, and entire generations toward an unknown future. Crossing the Atlantic was no small journey. Even with modern steam-powered ships, the voyage often lasted nearly a week, and the experience varied dramatically depending on the passenger's wealth. First-class travelers enjoyed elegant dining rooms, luxurious cabins, fine music, and attentive service, while those in third class often traveled in much simpler accommodations. Yet whether rich or poor, every passenger shared the same destination and the same vast ocean. As demand for transatlantic travel grew, fierce competition emerged among the world's great shipping companies. Each wanted to offer faster crossings, greater comfort, and unmatched prestige. Newspapers closely followed every new launch, celebrating engineering achievements as symbols of national pride. Owning the finest ocean liner was no longer just good business, it was a statement of power, innovation, and international influence. Two companies stood at the center of this rivalry. One was determined to build the fastest ships on Earth, believing speed would win the hearts of travelers. The other believed something different. Instead of chasing records alone, it envisioned ships so enormous, so luxurious, and so technologically advanced that passengers would choose comfort and elegance over a few hours saved at sea. That vision belonged to the White Star Line. Its leaders understood that the future of ocean travel was changing. Wealthy passengers desired floating palaces rather than simple transportation, while immigrants wanted safer and more reliable voyages. If a single ship could satisfy both dreams, it could become the most admired vessel ever built. The company imagined a liner unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would be longer than city blocks, taller than many buildings, and filled with innovations that seemed almost unbelievable. Electric elevators, grand staircases, heated swimming pools, luxurious suites, and powerful engines would combine into one magnificent creation. Every detail would send the same message. Humanity had entered a new age, and this ship would be its greatest achievement. Few people questioned whether such ambition might carry hidden risks. In an age when engineering conquered rivers, mountains, and cities, confidence often outweighed caution. The belief that human ingenuity could master even the mighty Atlantic had become almost unquestioned. That confidence would soon give birth to a legend. The race had begun, but one company intended to build something history would never forget. At the dawn of the 20th century, the competition to rule the Atlantic Ocean had become more than a contest between shipping companies. It was a battle of national pride, engineering brilliance, and commercial ambition. Every new vessel represented a country's industrial strength, and every successful voyage was celebrated as proof that humanity had entered a new era of progress. Among the giants of this rapidly changing world stood one company, determined to redefine luxury at sea: the White Star Line. Unlike some of its rivals, White Star Line did not believe that speed alone would win the future. Fast crossings attracted headlines, but the company's leaders saw another opportunity. Wealthy travelers no longer wanted to endure the Atlantic, they wanted to enjoy it. Crossing the ocean was becoming part of the experience itself. Instead of building the fastest ship ever launched, White Star dreamed of creating the most comfortable, elegant, and magnificent ocean liner the world had ever seen. To bring that vision to life, White Star partnered with the famous Belfast shipbuilders Harlan and Wolff, one of the most respected shipyards on Earth. Together they imagined an entirely new class of vessels unlike anything that had sailed before. These ships would be enormous in scale, breathtaking in appearance, and filled with technological innovations that pushed the limits of modern engineering. This ambitious project became known as the Olympic class. The class would consist of three sister ships: Olympic, Titanic, and later Britannic. Each vessel would be larger than nearly every ship that had come before it. Their immense size was not simply for prestige, it allowed designers to create unprecedented levels of luxury and stability. The ships were intended to glide smoothly across the Atlantic, while offering passengers an experience that felt more like staying in an exclusive grand hotel than traveling aboard a ship. That philosophy transformed every aspect of the design. Passengers entering the first-class areas would find a world that revealed the finest hotels in London or Paris. The magnificent grand staircase rose beneath an elegant glass dome, surrounded by polished oak, ornate ironwork, and richly carved details. Luxurious dining rooms served elaborate multi-course meals prepared by world-class chefs. There were reading rooms, smoking lounges, cafes inspired by Parisian streets, Turkish baths, a heated swimming pool, squash courts, electric elevators, and spacious suites decorated with remarkable craftsmanship. Even second-class accommodations surpassed the first-class standards of many other ships operating at the time. Third-class passengers, many of them immigrants hoping for new lives in America, also experienced cleaner cabins, better food, and greater comfort than they could expect on most competing liners. White Star wanted every passenger, regardless of social class, to feel they were traveling aboard the finest ship afloat. Yet luxury alone did not make Titanic extraordinary. Behind the elegant interiors lay one of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of its age. Titanic stretched nearly 270 meters from bow to stern and weighed over 46,000 tons. Massive steam engines worked alongside an innovative turbine system to power three enormous propellers. Beneath the decks, an intricate network of boilers, pumps, generators, and electrical systems kept the floating city alive every hour of the day. Perhaps the feature that inspired the greatest confidence was the ship's safety design. Titanic contained 16 watertight compartments, separated by heavy steel bulkheads. If the hull were damaged, engineers believed that flooding could be isolated to only a few compartments while the rest of the ship remained afloat. Advanced pumps and automatic watertight doors added another layer of protection, creating the impression that the vessel could survive accidents that would doom ordinary ships. Newspapers praised these innovations enthusiastically. Engineers admired the unprecedented scale of the project, while the public marveled at photographs of the colossal liner taking shape in Belfast. Although the phrase unsinkable was often exaggerated by newspapers and public opinion, rather than being an official company claim, it quickly became attached to Titanic's reputation. The ship came to symbolize something larger than steel and machinery. It represented humanity's growing belief that technology had finally conquered nature. Standing beneath the towering hull while it was still under construction, visitors could scarcely believe human hands had created something so immense. Every rivet, every steel plate, and every polished corridor seemed to proclaim the same message. This was not merely another passenger ship, it was the pinnacle of modern civilization. For many people, Titanic was more than a vessel crossing an ocean. It was proof that the impossible had become possible. But history has often shown that the greatest achievements can also inspire the greatest overconfidence. And soon the world's most magnificent ship would face a force that no engineer could fully control. Long before the Titanic became the most famous ship in history, it was an extraordinary construction project that captured the imagination of an entire nation. To build the largest moving object ever created by human hands required more than bold ideas or ambitious blueprints. It demanded an army of skilled workers, revolutionary engineering, and years of relentless effort. That remarkable journey began in the thriving shipbuilding city of Belfast, on the eastern coast of Ireland. At the beginning of the 20th century, Belfast was one of the world's greatest industrial centers. The city echoed with the sounds of steel mills, foundries, and factories working day and night. Towering smokestacks dominated the skyline, while the harbor bustled with cargo ships arriving from every corner of the globe. Shipbuilding had become the heartbeat of the city, providing employment for thousands of families and giving Belfast an international reputation for craftsmanship and innovation. At the center of this industrial powerhouse stood the legendary shipyard of Harland and Wolff. Founded in the 19th century, the company had earned a reputation for building some of the safest and most luxurious vessels afloat. Yet nothing in its history compared to the challenge that now lay before its engineers. White Star Line had entrusted the company with building not one, but three gigantic sister ships of the Olympic class. Among them, Titanic would soon become the most celebrated. Preparing for the project required transforming the shipyard itself. Existing facilities were simply not large enough to accommodate vessels of such unprecedented size. New construction slips were built, workshops expanded, and enormous gantries rose above the docks. The most impressive of all was the gigantic steel framework known as the Arrow Gantry. Stretching high above the shipyard, it towered over Belfast like the skeleton of a massive cathedral. Equipped with powerful cranes, platforms, and lifting equipment, it allowed workers to assemble the enormous hull piece by piece. For many visitors, the structure alone was one of the engineering wonders of Europe. Every morning before sunrise, thousands of workers poured through the shipyard gates. Riveters, steelworkers, blacksmiths, carpenters, electricians, engineers, painters, and laborers each had a role in bringing the enormous vessel to life. At the height of construction, more than 15,000 men were involved in building the Olympic-class ships. Their work was physically exhausting and often dangerous. They climbed dizzying heights without modern safety harnesses, balanced on narrow beams, and handled red-hot steel in every kind of weather. The sound inside the yard was unforgettable. Steam hammers pounded relentlessly. Rivet guns echoed across the harbor. Molten metal hissed as it cooled, while cranes slowly lifted steel plates weighing several tons into place. Clouds of smoke drifted above the workers, mixing with sparks that rained from cutting torches. Communication often depended on shouted commands and hand signals, since the roar of machinery drowned out ordinary conversation. It was less like a construction site and more like a giant mechanical orchestra performing without pause. Titanic's skeleton gradually emerged from thousands of individual steel plates. Each plate had to be carefully aligned before being secured with millions of rivets. Most of these rivets were installed entirely by hand. Teams of workers heated each rivet until it glowed bright orange, tossed it through the air to another worker waiting several meters away, inserted it into the hull, and hammered it into place before it cooled. Process demanded remarkable speed, strength, and precision. A single mistake could weaken the structure or delay the schedule. Although the ship represented the most advanced technology of its era, the work remained intensely human. Every beam, every compartment, every reflected countless hours of physical labor. There were no computerized machines or automated assembly lines. Instead, Titanic rose from the combined skill of thousands of craftsmen whose knowledge had been passed down through generations. But greatness came at a cost. Construction sites in the early 20th century were far more hazardous than those of today. Safety regulations were limited, protective equipment was minimal, and accidents were tragically common. Workers risked falling from towering scaffolds, being crushed by heavy steel plates, or suffering severe burns from molten metal. Historical records indicate that several workers lost their lives during the construction of Titanic, while hundreds more sustained injuries ranging from broken bones to permanent disabilities. Many incidents went unreported by modern standards, accepted as unfortunate realities of industrial labor. Despite these dangers, the workforce pressed forward with determination. For many families in Belfast, employment at Harland and Wolff was both an honor and a necessity. Every completed section of the ship filled the city with pride. As Titanic grew larger each week, Local residents gathered along the harbor simply to admire its astonishing size. Newspapers celebrated the project as proof that British engineering stood at the forefront of the modern world. By the time the immense hull finally dominated the Belfast skyline, it seemed almost impossible to believe that such a colossal structure would one day float upon the sea. Steel sweat and human ambition had combined to create what many considered the greatest machine ever built. Yet the most dramatic moment was still to come. Soon, the world would gather to witness the launch of a ship that seemed too enormous to belong on the water at all. Imagine that is a crisp spring morning in April 1912. The Titanic is preparing for another peaceful day at sea. Sunlight pours across the polished decks as the Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction. The ship moves so smoothly that many passengers can barely feel the engines beneath their feet. For those aboard, it feels less like sailing across an ocean and more like staying inside the finest hotel ever created. Welcome aboard the Titanic. As you step through the grand entrance, your eyes are immediately drawn to what many considered the heart of the ship, the magnificent grand staircase. Rising through several decks beneath an elegant glass dome, the staircase was a masterpiece of Edwardian design. Rich oak panels lined the walls, while beautifully carved balustrades curved gracefully toward the upper floors. At its center stood an ornate clock surrounded by decorative woodwork, a familiar meeting place where passengers gathered before dinner or simply admired the craftsmanship. Every detail reflected elegance, from the gleaming brass railings to the soft carpets beneath each step. Walking farther into the ship, you would discover comforts that few people expected to find at sea. Titanic featured a heated swimming pool, an astonishing luxury at the time. Nearby were changing rooms, hot and cold baths, and even facilities designed to help passengers relax after a long journey. It was one of the very first ocean liners to offer such amenities, demonstrating that this voyage was meant to be an experience rather than merely transportation. For those who preferred to stay active, the ship included a fully equipped gymnasium. Here, passengers could exercise on rowing machines, stationary bicycles, mechanical horses, and even an unusual device that simulated riding a camel. Under the guidance of an instructor, guests could maintain their daily routines while crossing one of the world's largest oceans. The idea seemed almost unbelievable for the era, yet it perfectly reflected White Star Line's ambition to provide every modern convenience imaginable. Just beyond the gym awaited one of Titanic's most unique attractions, the luxurious Turkish bath. Inspired by the grand bathhouses of the Ottoman Empire, these beautifully decorated rooms offered steam chambers, heated marble benches, massage treatments, and quiet spaces designed for complete relaxation. Soft lighting, colorful tiles, and warm temperatures created an atmosphere far removed from the cold Atlantic outside. For many first-class passengers, it was the ultimate symbol of luxury and refinement. As evening approached, another remarkable experience awaited. Titanic's elegant à la carte restaurant, operated independently from the main dining saloon, served sophisticated French cuisine prepared by talented chefs. Crystal chandeliers illuminated beautifully arranged tables, while attentive waiters served multiple courses accompanied by fine wines. Gentle conversation mixed with the sound of silverware and live music, making dinner feel more like an evening in Paris than a meal aboard a ship. Afterward, many gentlemen retired to the richly furnished smoking room, where leather chairs, dark wood paneling, and warm fireplaces created an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. Here they discussed politics, business, travel, and the future while enjoying premium cigars and brandy. Nearby passengers seeking a quieter evening could visit the ship's elegant library, where comfortable chairs and carefully selected books offered a peaceful escape. Some spent hours reading beside large windows, watching the endless Atlantic drift peacefully past. The first-class suites themselves were unlike anything previously seen on an ocean liner. Many featured private sitting rooms, luxurious bedrooms, beautifully decorated bathrooms, electric lighting, and handcrafted furniture inspired by famous European palaces. Wealthy passengers often remarked that their accommodations rivaled the finest five-star hotels in London, Paris, or New York. Every curtain, carpet, painting, and piece of furniture had been chosen with extraordinary care. For the richest travelers, life aboard Titanic felt almost effortless. Yet only a few decks below, another world existed. The third-class passengers experienced a very different voyage. Their cabins were simple, often shared by families or groups of travelers, with sturdy bunk beds, plain wooden furniture, and modest personal space. There were no marble staircases or luxurious lounges. Meals were straightforward, practical, and nourishing rather than extravagant. Entertainment came not from elegant orchestras or lavish salons but from conversations, songs, laughter, and the shared excitement of beginning a new life across the Atlantic. Many of these passengers were immigrants leaving behind everything they had ever known. They carried little more than suitcases, family photographs, and dreams of opportunity in America. Although their accommodations were far less luxurious than those of first class, Titanic still offered them cleaner cabins, better food, and greater comfort than many other ships of the era. For countless families, simply traveling aboard such a magnificent vessel represented hope for a brighter future. On Titanic, wealth shaped nearly every part of daily life. The grand staircases, luxurious restaurants, elegant libraries, and private suites belonged to one world, while the modest corridors and crowded cabins belonged to another. Yet despite these differences, everyone shared the same steel hull, the same engines, and the same endless Atlantic stretching beyond the windows. None of them could possibly imagine that within a few days, those invisible social divisions would be tested in ways no one had ever expected. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the docks of Southampton were alive with excitement. Steam drifted into the cool spring air as whistles echoed across the harbor. Dock workers hurried between carts piled high with luggage, horses pulled wagons loaded with supplies, and crowds gathered simply to catch a glimpse of the magnificent new liner that everyone was talking about. Towering above the waterfront stood the Titanic, her four great funnels rising into the sky like monuments to a new industrial age. To many she was the largest ship ever built, but history would remember her for something far more personal, because the Titanic was never just a ship. She was home, if only for a few days, to more than 2,200 souls, each carrying a different dream, a different destination, and a different story. Some passengers arrived in elegant motorcars, dressed in tailored suits and fashionable gowns. Others stepped onto the dock, carrying everything they owned inside a single worn suitcase. Some boarded with excitement, others with nervous anticipation, and a few with quiet sadness as they left loved ones behind. None of them knew they were becoming part of one of history's most unforgettable journeys. Among the first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. Millionaires, industrialists, bankers, politicians, and members of high society filled the luxurious cabins. They discussed business opportunities, planned holidays, and looked forward to arriving in New York in style. For them, Titanic represented the very best that modern civilization could offer. One of the most famous was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America. A successful businessman, inventor and author. Astor was traveling home with his young wife Madeline, who was expecting their first child. The couple had spent months traveling through Europe and Egypt before deciding to return aboard the world's newest ocean liner. Nearby traveled Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. Known for his elegance and generosity, Guggenheim boarded Titanic accompanied by members of his household. Like many others in first class, he expected a peaceful voyage filled with fine dining and pleasant conversation. Another remarkable passenger was Margaret, Molly Brown, a philanthropist from Colorado whose courage would later make her one of the disaster's most celebrated survivors. Friendly, energetic, and admired by many aboard, she had no idea that history would one day remember her as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Yet beyond the luxurious suites, another story was unfolding. Deep within the lower decks were hundreds of third-class passengers. Entire families from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East crowded into modest cabins. Many had sold nearly everything they owned to purchase a one-way ticket to America. Fathers dreamed of finding stable work. Mothers imagined safer futures for their children. Young men hoped to build successful lives in cities they had only seen in photographs. For them, Titanic was not a symbol of luxury. It was a bridge toward hope. Children explored the corridors with endless curiosity, laughing as the great ship gently rolled beneath their feet. Parents spoke excitedly about New York, wondering what their new lives might bring. They carried recipes, family Bibles, treasured letters, and small keepsakes, simple reminders of homes they might never see again. Above and below these passengers worked another remarkable community, the crew. More than 800 officers, engineers, stewards, cooks, cleaners, firemen, postal workers, and sailors kept the enormous vessel operating around the clock. Long before most passengers awoke, stokers labored deep inside the boiler rooms, shoveling mountains of coal into roaring furnaces that powered Titanic's engines. The heat was intense, the air thick with dust, and the work physically exhausting. Yet few passengers ever saw the men whose labor kept the floating city moving across the Atlantic. In the kitchens, dozens of chefs and cooks prepared thousands of meals every single day. Fresh bread emerged from enormous ovens, vegetables were carefully trimmed, elaborate desserts decorated, and countless dishes served with remarkable precision. Feeding more than 2,000 people aboard a moving ship required extraordinary organization and teamwork. Elsewhere, the ship's talented musicians rehearsed elegant waltzes like classical pieces and popular songs of the day. Their performances filled the dining rooms, reception halls, and lounges with warmth and sophistication, creating an atmosphere that made passengers feel completely at ease. Few could imagine that these same musicians would one day become symbols of courage remembered around the world. Hidden even farther below were Titanic's dedicated engineers, responsible for maintaining one of the most complex mechanical systems ever installed aboard a ship. Day and night they monitored boilers, turbines, generators, pumps, and electrical equipment. Their work was largely invisible, yet without them, the magnificent liner could not travel a single mile. Watching over everyone was Captain Edward John Smith, the most respected captain in White Star Line's service. After decades at sea, Smith had earned a reputation for calm leadership and professionalism. Titanic was expected to be the crowning achievement of his distinguished career before retirement. Many passengers felt reassured simply knowing that such an experienced captain commanded the ship. Also aboard was Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer from Harland and Wolff. Unlike many executives, Andrews believed in personally inspecting every detail of the vessel during its maiden voyage. He walked the corridors, spoke with passengers, and quietly noted improvements that could benefit future ships. Few people understood Titanic better than the man who had helped create her from the very first drawing. Representing White Star Line itself was J. Bruce Ismay, the company's chairman. For Ismay, this voyage was more than a crossing of the Atlantic. It was a public demonstration that White Star had fulfilled its ambitious vision. Every satisfied passenger, every admiring newspaper headline, and every successful mile strengthened the company's reputation. As the final ropes were released and the giant liner slowly moved away from Southampton, cheers echoed across the harbour, hats were waved from crowded docks, handkerchiefs fluttered from the decks, and families watched until the shoreline faded into the distance. No one could know what lay ahead. At that moment, the millionaire dining beneath crystal chandeliers, the immigrant child dreaming of America, the engineer tending the engines, the violinist polishing his instrument, the chef preparing dinner, the captain on the bridge, and the ship's own designer all shared the same quiet confidence. They believed they were sailing aboard the safest ship ever built. Within just a few days, fate would prove that the Atlantic Ocean cared nothing for wealth, status, profession, or dreams, and every one of those 2,200 lives would be changed forever. The morning of April 10, 1912, arrived with cool spring air and clear skies over the bustling port of Southampton. Along the docks, thousands of people gathered to witness an event unlike any they had seen before. Families embraced one last time. Friends waved handkerchiefs through tears and smiles. Journalists hurried from one viewpoint to another, eager to record the departure of the largest passenger ship ever built. Towering above them all stood the Titanic. Her freshly painted black hull gleamed beneath the morning sun, while four enormous funnels stretched proudly toward the sky. Thin clouds of steam drifted from the ship as powerful engines slowly came to life deep below the decks. Everything about the vessel suggested confidence, elegance, and strength. To those watching from shore, it seemed impossible that anything so magnificent could ever come to harm. Then at exactly noon the silence was broken. Titanic's mighty whistles echoed across Southampton water. The deep, thunderous blasts rolled through the harbour, bouncing off warehouses, ships, and distant buildings before fading into the spring sky. It was a sound unlike anything many people had ever heard, a voice announcing that a new giant was about to begin her first journey. Dock workers released the final mooring lines. Slowly, almost gracefully, the immense liner began to move. Passengers lined every deck, waving enthusiastically to loved ones standing on the pier below. Some laughed with excitement. Others wiped away tears, wondering when or if they would see home again. A brass band played cheerful music as photographers captured what they believed would become one of the proudest moments in maritime history. Yet within minutes of departure, an unexpected danger appeared. As Titanic passed another large passenger liner, the SS New York, something extraordinary happened. The enormous displacement of water created by Titanic's massive hull generated a powerful suction effect. The smaller vessel suddenly broke free from its mooring lines and began drifting directly toward the departing giant. For a brief moment, confusion swept across the harbor. Crew members shouted warnings. Tugboats rushed into action. Passengers watched anxiously from the rails as the distance between the two ships rapidly disappeared. The possibility of a collision seemed frighteningly real. Captain Edward Smith reacted immediately, ordering the engines reversed, while tugboats struggled to pull the drifting vessel away. Slowly, almost painfully, the gap between the ships stopped shrinking. At the very last moment, disaster was avoided by only a narrow margin. Many passengers laughed nervously once the danger had passed. treating it as an exciting story to tell during dinner. Others simply shrugged it off as an unusual coincidence. Few imagined that this near accident would later be remembered as an unsettling beginning to Titanic's brief life. With the harbor safely behind her, Titanic continued south across the English Channel toward her first scheduled stop, the French port of Cherbourg. Unlike Southampton, Cherbourg lacked a dock large enough for the enormous liner. Instead, smaller tender boats ferried passengers, luggage, and mail between the harbor and the waiting ship. As evening settled over the coast of France, elegant ladies in fashionable dresses and distinguished gentlemen in tailored suits climbed aboard. Among them were wealthy businessmen, aristocrats, and internationally known figures eager to experience the world's newest luxury liner. The stop was brief but lively. Lights reflected across the calm harbor as workers efficiently loaded supplies, while passengers admired Titanic's magnificent profile illuminated against the night sky. Before long the anchor was raised once again, and the great ship quietly slipped back into the darkness. Her next destination lay across the Celtic Sea. By the following day, Titanic reached Queenstown, Ireland, known today as Cobh. This final European stop presented a striking contrast to glamorous Cherbourg. Here, hundreds of third-class passengers waited anxiously along the waterfront. Entire families carried battered trunks, woven baskets, and treasured possessions wrapped carefully in blankets. Many had traveled long distances from villages scattered across Ireland, hoping to begin new lives in America. Children gazed upward in amazement. The ship seemed impossibly large. Parents held tightly to their sons and daughters as they boarded, carrying not only luggage but dreams of opportunity, safety, and prosperity. Some kissed relatives goodbye through tears, knowing they might never meet again. Mail bags filled with thousands of letters were loaded aboard alongside fresh provisions and final supplies. These ordinary envelopes carried birthday wishes, business contracts, love letters, and family news destined for homes across the Atlantic. None of their writers knew many would never reach their intended recipients. By early afternoon the last passengers had boarded. The final ropes were released. Queenstown slowly disappeared behind the stern as Ireland faded into the distance. Now there would be no more ports, no more land. Ahead stretched the vast Atlantic Ocean. For the next several days, nothing surrounded Titanic except endless water and open sky. The sea appeared calm, almost welcoming. Gentle waves sparkled beneath bright sunshine, while seabirds gradually disappeared behind the ship. Each passing hour carried the liner farther from Europe and closer to the shores of North America. Life aboard quickly settled into a comfortable rhythm. First-class passengers strolled the promenade decks, enjoying fresh sea air and afternoon conversations. Children played games while stewards attended to every request. Elegant dinners, concerts, afternoon tea, and lively card games filled the hours. In third class, music, laughter, dancing, and hopeful conversations echoed through the corridors as families imagined the futures waiting beyond the horizon. Below deck, engineers carefully monitored the engines. Firemen shoveled coal into blazing furnaces without rest. Officers navigated by stars, charts, and compass. Everything worked exactly as planned. The voyage felt effortless. Looking back today, those peaceful scenes carry a quiet sadness. Every smile captured in a photograph, every letter written home, every conversation on the promenade, and every hopeful dream belonged to people who believed they had many more days ahead. None of them knew that this magnificent voyage was quietly approaching its final chapter. For the ship that had inspired the world's greatest confidence was sailing toward an invisible danger hidden somewhere within the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. It would be her first crossing. And tragically, it would also be her last. By the time Titanic had left the last traces of Ireland behind, life aboard the great liner had settled into an almost effortless rhythm. The Atlantic was unusually calm, its gentle swells barely noticeable beneath the immense ship. Each sunrise brought another peaceful day at sea, and for those on board, it seemed impossible to imagine that anything could disturb the quiet confidence surrounding them. Every morning began with soft footsteps echoing through polished corridors as stewards delivered tea, coffee, and breakfast to waiting cabins. Curtains were drawn back to reveal an endless blue horizon stretching in every direction. The fresh ocean air drifted through open promenade decks, carrying with it the scent of salt water and the comforting hum of the ship's powerful engines far below. For first-class passengers, the day unfolded like a carefully planned holiday at an elegant seaside resort. Breakfast was served on fine china beneath sparkling chandeliers. Gentle conversations filled the dining saloon as wealthy travelers discussed business ventures, European politics, or the latest fashions from Paris and London. Some planned afternoon card games, while others arranged walks around the promenade deck, enjoying the surprisingly mild spring weather. After breakfast, many passengers gathered beneath the magnificent grand staircase before wandering through the luxurious lounges. Ladies admired the beautifully decorated rooms, while gentlemen relaxed with newspapers delivered before departure. Others visited the library, quietly turning pages as sunlight streamed through large windows overlooking the Atlantic. It was easy to forget that they were hundreds of miles from land. Outside, the open decks were alive with activity. Children laughed as they raced one another along the wooden promenade, their voices carried away by the sea breeze. Parents watched from nearby benches, smiling as their sons and daughters. It seemed like an endless floating playground. Sailors occasionally paused in their duties to wave at the youngsters, whose excitement reminded everyone that this journey represented adventure rather than routine. Older passengers wrapped themselves in blankets against the cool ocean air, settling comfortably into deck chairs with newspapers or novels. Some simply gazed toward the horizon, mesmerized by the endless meeting of sea and sky. Conversations drifted lazily from one chair to another, touching on everything from family memories to future plans in New York. Time seemed to move more slowly aboard Titanic, measured not by clocks but by meals, music, and sunsets. As afternoon turned into evening, the ship revealed another side of its extraordinary character. The dining rooms came alive with elegance and celebration. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of electric lights, while silver cutlery sparkled upon perfectly arranged tables. Multi-course dinners featured fresh oysters, fine meats, delicate pastries, and exotic fruits carried aboard specifically for the voyage. Waiters moved gracefully through the room with practiced precision, ensuring every guest experienced impeccable service. Nearby, the ship's orchestra filled the lounges with beautiful melodies. The talented musicians performed light classical pieces, popular waltzes, and cheerful selections that encouraged conversation rather than overwhelming it. Couples paused to listen before continuing their evening strolls. Laughter echoed through the reception rooms, blending harmoniously with the music and the gentle vibration of the engines beneath the polished floors. Far below these luxurious spaces, life looked very different, but no less hopeful. In third class, families gathered after dinner to sing traditional songs from Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Different languages filled the corridors, yet the emotions were shared by all. Fathers spoke excitedly about jobs waiting in America. Mothers imagined homes where their children would grow up with greater opportunities. Young couples dreamed of building new lives together in cities they had never seen, except in stories and photographs. Children who had spent days exploring every corner of their modest accommodations finally drifted to sleep, unaware that history would one day remember them alongside the world's wealthiest passengers. Throughout the voyage, countless letters were written. Some were simple postcards describing the magnificence of the ship, others were heartfelt messages filled with excitement about the future. "The ship is wonderful," one passenger wrote. "We are having a marvelous crossing." Another promised to send for relatives once they found work in America. A young woman carefully described the elegance of the grand staircase so vividly that her family could almost picture it. Businessmen drafted contracts. Students wrote about their adventures. Parents reassured loved ones that the voyage was comfortable and safe. Many of these letters were placed into the ship's mailroom, waiting to be delivered upon arrival in New York. None of their authors realized they were writing the final words their families would ever receive. As darkness settled over the Atlantic each evening, Titanic became a glowing island of light surrounded by endless black water. Her illuminated windows reflected softly across the calm sea, while smoke drifted peacefully from the funnels into a sky crowded with brilliant stars. Passengers retired to comfortable cabins believing tomorrow would be much like today, another quiet day filled with conversation, music, laughter, and anticipation. Everything felt perfectly ordinary. Every smile, every shared meal, every handwritten letter, every child's laughter seemed to confirm that the voyage was unfolding exactly as everyone had hoped. Yet somewhere beyond the reach of those warm lights, hidden within the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic, enormous fields of drifting ice were silently waiting. The peaceful days aboard the floating palace were drawing to an end. And before another sunrise arrived, the lives of everyone on board would change forever. For the first several days of the voyage, the Atlantic had been remarkably kind to Titanic. The sea remained calm, the skies were clear, and the ship continued westward with quiet confidence. Passengers settled comfortably into their routines, while the crew carried out their duties with practiced precision. There was little to suggest that anything unusual lay ahead. But by Sunday, April 14, 1912, subtle changes began to appear. At first they seemed almost insignificant. The morning air felt noticeably colder than it had the day before. Passengers stepping onto the promenade decks reached for heavier coats and woolen scarves. A sharper breeze swept across the open ocean, carrying with it a chill that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the horizon. Stewards quietly closed more windows, while many guests chose to remain indoors a little longer after breakfast. Few gave it much thought. After all, the ship was sailing across the northern Atlantic in early spring. Cooler weather was expected. Yet the ocean itself was beginning to tell a different story. As Titanic steamed farther west, the water gradually changed in appearance. The deep blue surface that had reflected brilliant sunshine throughout the voyage became darker, calmer, and strangely still. Experienced sailors noticed that the sea seemed almost unnaturally smooth. There were very few waves, and the gentle swells that usually rolled across the Atlantic had almost disappeared. To ordinary passengers, the calm ocean looked beautiful. To seasoned mariners, it could be unsettling. Small waves normally broke against floating ice, creating white foam that could reveal an iceberg even in darkness. But on a perfectly calm night, those warning ripples would not exist. An iceberg could remain nearly invisible until a ship was dangerously close. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles ahead, Enormous fields of sea ice drifted silently southward from Greenland. They had broken away months earlier, carried by powerful currents into one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Throughout the day, Titanic's wireless operators began receiving an increasing number of radio messages from other ships. The reports all carried similar warnings: ice, large ice fields, pack ice, numerous icebergs directly along the western shipping routes. One after another, nearby vessels informed Titanic that dangerous conditions lay ahead. Some captains described massive floating mountains of ice stretching across the sea. Others reported smaller bergs scattered over wide areas, making navigation increasingly difficult. Every warning reached the ship's wireless room, but the wireless operators faced another challenge. Their primary responsibility was not weather forecasting, it was communication. Passengers aboard Titanic were sending hundreds of personal messages every day. Wealthy businessmen transmitted important financial instructions to New York. Families sent cheerful updates to relatives waiting across the Atlantic. Friends exchanged greetings, while travelers shared stories about the magnificent new liner. The wireless equipment rarely rested. Operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked tirelessly, often for long hours, clearing an enormous backlog of passenger telegrams that had accumulated after earlier technical problems with the radio system. Every minute counted, and commercial messages took priority because they represented an important service offered by the White Star Line. As a result, some of the ice warnings did not immediately receive the attention they might have deserved. They were acknowledged, written down, or passed along, but not always with the urgency that later generations would expect. It was not because anyone ignored the danger completely. Rather, the culture of ocean travel at the time viewed icebergs as a familiar seasonal hazard. Captains had encountered them before. Ships had successfully navigated around them countless times. Most believed careful observation and steady navigation would be enough. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith received several reports concerning the growing ice field. His officers also remained aware of the changing conditions. Although no order was given to dramatically reduce speed, the crew maintained a careful lookout as evening approached. That decision has been debated for more than a century. Some historians argue that many ships of the era routinely maintained speed, unless visibility became poor. Others believe greater caution should have been exercised after receiving multiple ice warnings. Whatever the reasoning, Titanic continued westward at a pace that reflected the confidence of her age, a confidence built upon modern engineering, experienced officers, and the belief that the great liner could safely handle whatever the Atlantic presented. As daylight slowly faded, temperatures continued to fall. Passengers finishing dinner noticed the cold air waiting outside the dining rooms. Some wrapped themselves in heavy coats before taking one last stroll along the promenade deck. Others chose the warmth of the lounges, where music from the orchestra drifted softly through polished corridors. Above them, the sky remained astonishingly clear. There was no fog, no rain, no storm. Millions of stars glittered with breathtaking brilliance across the heavens, while the moon remained absent, leaving the ocean wrapped in deep darkness. Without moonlight, the sea and sky merged into one endless black horizon. From the bridge, the night appeared peaceful, almost too peaceful. In the crow's nest high above the decks, lookouts strained their eyes against the freezing wind, scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The cold became so intense that their breath turned instantly into mist. Every shadow on the horizon demanded careful attention. Below, inside warm cabins, most passengers had already retired for the night. Children slept peacefully, Couples talked quietly before turning out the lights. Letters were folded away. Books were closed. The orchestra packed up after another successful evening performance. Deep beneath the ship, engineers continued feeding coal into roaring furnaces as Titanic pressed steadily onward through the silent Atlantic. No panic filled the corridors. No alarm bells rang. The ship remained calm, elegant, and seemingly invincible. Yet somewhere ahead, hidden within that motionless black sea, a wall of ancient ice waited without sound or warning. With every turn of the propellers, Titanic drew closer. And although no one aboard could possibly know it, the final hours of the world's greatest voyage had already begun. The evening of Sunday, April 14th, 1912, unfolded with remarkable calm. Dinner had ended hours earlier. The last conversations in the first-class lounges gradually faded into silence. Music from the orchestra had come to an end, and passengers slowly returned to their cabins after another peaceful day aboard what many believed to be the safest ship ever built. Outside, the North Atlantic lay almost perfectly still. There was no storm, no crashing waves, no heavy rain. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, filled with countless brilliant stars. Without the light of the moon, they appeared brighter than ever, scattered across the heavens like countless diamonds. To anyone standing on deck, it was breathtaking. To experienced sailors, it was unsettling. The sea had become unnaturally calm. Normally, waves breaking against an iceberg created a line of white foam that could be seen from a considerable distance, even on a dark night. But now the ocean looked like polished black glass. The horizon had almost disappeared, blending seamlessly into the darkness of the sky. It was the worst possible night to encounter ice. High above the decks, inside the small wooden crow's nest fixed to the forward mast, two lookouts stood watch. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had spent hours staring into the endless darkness. The freezing wind cut through their heavy clothing, numbing their faces and hands. Their eyes constantly searched for the slightest change in the horizon, knowing that a single mistake could have unimaginable consequences. The cold grew sharper with every passing minute. Far below them, Titanic continued westward at approximately 22 knots, her engines beating with steady confidence. Deep inside the ship, enormous boilers roared as coal was shoveled relentlessly into blazing furnaces. The giant liner never seemed to hesitate. It was now approaching 11:40 at night. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch supervised the watch. Around him, the officers observed the quiet sea, believing the night to be challenging but manageable. Everything appeared normal. Then, something changed. At first, it was little more than a shadow, a faint shape, a darkness within the darkness. Frederick Fleet narrowed his eyes. The object seemed to grow larger. He leaned forward, trying to separate the mysterious silhouette from the black horizon. Another second passed. Now there could be no doubt. A massive wall stood directly ahead, an iceberg. Fleet reacted instantly. His hands seized the warning bell. Clang once, clang twice, clang 3 times. The sharp sound echoed through the freezing night, carrying one unmistakable meaning to the bridge below. Danger straight ahead. Without hesitation, Fleet grabbed the telephone connected directly to the officers. His voice broke the silence. Iceberg right ahead. The words reached the bridge in an instant. First Officer Murdoch did not hesitate. Years of experience took over before conscious thought could catch up. He immediately issued a series of rapid commands. Harder starboard. Under the steering system used at the time, the order caused the ship's bow to begin turning to port to the left. Almost simultaneously came another command. Full astern. The engine room received orders to reverse the massive engines as quickly as possible, an enormous mechanical challenge for a ship of Titanic's size. Then another order followed. Close the watertight doors. Electric switches were activated. Throughout the lower decks, heavy steel doors began descending between the watertight compartments, designed to isolate flooding if the hull were damaged. Every second mattered. On the bridge, officers fixed their eyes on the looming shape ahead. Titanic slowly began to answer the helm. But she was a giant. More than 46,000 tons of steel cannot change direction instantly. Momentum carried the ship relentlessly forward. In the crow's nest, Fleet watched helplessly as the iceberg grew larger and larger. From the forward decks, a few passengers noticed a strange dark mass emerging from the night. Some pointed toward it. Others barely paid attention. There was still no sense of panic. The engines vibrated differently as power changed below. The bow continued swinging. For a brief, hopeful moment, it appeared that Titanic might actually clear the obstacle. The enormous iceberg slowly slid past the starboard side. So close, almost unbelievably close. Then, a faint vibration traveled through the ship. Not a violent crash, not an explosive impact. Many passengers later described it as little more than a gentle shudder, as though the ship had rolled across a patch of rough pavement. Others heard a scraping sound. Deep below the waterline, however, an entirely different story was unfolding. The underwater shelf of the iceberg brushed against Titanic's starboard hull with tremendous force. Steel plates flexed. Thousands of rivets strained under pressure. Seams opened. The iceberg did not tear one enormous hole into the ship. Instead, it created a series of narrow openings stretching across multiple compartments beneath the waterline. One compartment, then another, then yet another. Freezing Atlantic water, barely above the point of freezing, rushed into the ship with astonishing speed. Within moments, thousands of tons of seawater were pouring through damaged sections of the hull. On the upper decks, most passengers remained completely unaware. Card games continued. Some people prepared for bed. Others laughed in the lounges, wondering only why the engines seemed quieter than before. A few curious passengers stepped outside after feeling the slight vibration. Some even bent over the rails and playfully kicked small pieces of ice that had landed on the forward deck during the scrape. No one imagined that the greatest maritime disaster of the 20th century had already begun. Inside the boiler rooms, engineers heard unfamiliar sounds. Crew members noticed water appearing where no water should ever be. The truth spread quietly, one compartment at a time. The ship had survived the collision. But she had not survived the damage. What seemed like a minor scrape against an iceberg had silently delivered a fatal wound beneath the surface, one that no passenger could see, and one that even the world's most magnificent ship would never recover from. Within minutes, the men who understood Titanic's design would reach a terrifying conclusion. The ship that the world believed could never sink was already dying. For a few moments after the collision, an eerie calm settled over the Titanic. There had been no deafening explosion. No towering wave crashing across the decks. No violent shudder that threw passengers from their beds. Instead, the world's largest ocean liner simply continued moving forward through the icy darkness, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The engines slowed, then gradually came to a stop. For the first time since leaving Southampton, the giant ship stood motionless in the middle of the North Atlantic. Many passengers barely noticed. Some had felt only a faint vibration beneath their feet. Others later recalled hearing what sounded like the tearing of cloth or the scraping of a giant hand along the ship's side. Curious travelers stepped out onto the promenade decks, pulling coats around their shoulders against the freezing air. A few laughed as they picked up small chunks of ice that had fallen onto the forward well deck during the collision. Children tossed pieces of ice at one another like snowballs. It seemed almost amusing. No one imagined that beneath the waterline, the fate of the Titanic had already been decided. Deep below the decks, inside the forward boiler rooms, crew members witnessed the terrifying truth. The sea was rushing in. At first it appeared as thin streams of water forcing their way between steel plates. Within seconds those streams became torrents. Ice-cold Atlantic water burst through damaged seams with incredible force, flooding the compartments faster than pumps could possibly remove it. Engineers immediately sounded the alarm. The watertight doors had already slammed shut, sealing off sections of the ship exactly as they had been designed to do. Massive steel barriers descended into place, trapping the flooding inside individual compartments. For a brief moment, it seemed the safety system might work. After all, Titanic had been engineered to survive serious damage. Her 16 watertight compartments were considered one of the greatest advances in naval architecture. Designers believed that even if several compartments flooded, the remaining sections would keep the ship safely afloat. But there was one devastating limitation. Titanic could remain afloat with 4 of her forward watertight compartments flooded. She could not survive 5. As officers hurried through the lower decks inspecting the damage, the grim reality became unmistakable. The iceberg had not punched one enormous hole through the hull. Instead, it had sliced a series of narrow openings across the starboard side beneath the waterline. Individually, each opening was relatively small. Together, they were catastrophic. Water poured into the forward cargo hold, then the mail room, then the first boiler room, then another. And yet another. 5 forward compartments had already been breached. The sea was winning. Captain Edward Smith quickly summoned the one man who understood the ship better than anyone else alive, Thomas Andrews. Unlike many designers who remained comfortably on shore after launching a vessel, Andrews had insisted on joining Titanic's maiden voyage. He wanted to observe every aspect of the ship's performance so future improvements could be made. Now, only hours after the collision, he walked rapidly through the damaged compartments with officers at his side. His inspection was methodical. He examined the flooding, measured the water, observed how quickly each compartment was filling. There was no panic in his movements. Only quiet concentration. Returning to the bridge, Andrews began making calculations based upon everything he had just seen. The mathematics were brutally simple. As the forward compartments filled, the bow became heavier. The heavier the bow became, the lower it settled into the ocean. As the bow sank, seawater would eventually spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads into the next compartment behind them. Those bulkheads extended upward but not all the way to the upper decks. They had been designed under the assumption that no more than 4 compartments would flood. Once water reached the top of one bulkhead, it would pour into the next compartment like water flowing from one step to another. The process would repeat again and again. Each flooded compartment would drag the bow lower. Each lower angle would allow water to reach another bulkhead. It was a chain reaction, one that could not be stopped. No pump aboard Titanic possessed the capacity to remove water as quickly as the Atlantic was pouring inside. No crew could patch the damaged hull beneath the freezing ocean. No maneuver could reverse what had already happened. After completing his calculations, Thomas Andrews quietly approached Captain Smith. Those nearby later remembered the gravity of the moment. There was no dramatic speech, no emotional outburst, only the calm voice of an engineer stating an unavoidable fact. The ship would sink. Estimates varied slightly, but Andrews believed Titanic had perhaps 1.5 to 2 hours remaining before disappearing beneath the sea. Captain Smith stood in stunned silence. For decades he had safely commanded some of the world's greatest passenger liners. Now he faced a situation that no experience could solve. The greatest ship ever built had received a wound from which it could never recover. The realization spread slowly among the senior officers. Some struggled to believe it. Others immediately understood what it meant. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. That uncomfortable truth, largely ignored during the voyage because the ship was considered exceptionally safe, suddenly became horrifyingly real. Above them, life continued almost normally. Passengers chatted in warm lounges. Some returned to bed after satisfying their curiosity about the strange stop in the middle of the ocean. Stewards quietly reassured anyone who asked questions. The orchestra's instruments rested where they had been left only minutes before. Children slept peacefully in their cabins. No one could yet see the invisible battle taking place below. Inside the engine rooms, however, engineers made an extraordinary decision. Knowing that the ship was doomed, they remained at their posts. They continued operating generators, maintaining electrical power, and keeping pumps running for as long as possible. Every extra minute of light, every working elevator, every functioning wireless transmitter might help save lives later in the night. They knew what staying behind could mean. Still, they continued their work. Meanwhile, Thomas Andrews walked quietly through the ship he had helped create. Only days earlier he had proudly admired every polished staircase, every luxurious suite, every beautifully crafted corridor. Now he understood that every one of them would soon lie beneath nearly 4,000 meters of icy Atlantic water. There would be no rescue for the ship itself, only a race to save the people aboard. The collision had lasted only seconds. The decision had already been made not by any captain or engineer, but by the cold mathematics of steel, water, and gravity. From this moment forward, the story of the Titanic was no longer about a magnificent voyage. It had become a desperate countdown toward one of history's greatest tragedies. When Captain Edward Smith finally accepted Thomas Andrews' devastating conclusion, the weight of the moment was almost unimaginable. The Titanic was sinking. Not might sink. Not could sink. She would sink. And there were barely enough lifeboats for half of the people on board. Yet despite this terrifying reality, the decks above remained strangely peaceful. Most passengers had no idea that anything was seriously wrong. Many had returned to bed after feeling the gentle collision, believing the ship had merely stopped to inspect some minor damage. Others continued playing cards, reading books, or chatting in the warm lounges. Stewards moved calmly through the corridors, smiling politely and reassuring anyone who asked questions. There was no screaming, no running, no panic, only a quiet uncertainty. Captain Smith knew that if fear spread too quickly, thousands of frightened people could overwhelm the crew before any organized evacuation began. He ordered the officers to prepare the lifeboats while passengers were gently asked to put on life jackets and come up to the boat deck as a precaution. To many, it sounded unnecessary. Some first-class passengers laughed. Others complained about leaving their warm cabins on such a bitterly cold night. One gentleman reportedly joked that he would rather stay inside than stand in freezing air wearing an uncomfortable life belt. A few women wrapped themselves in blankets and asked whether they would soon be allowed to return to bed. The ship still looked perfectly safe. Her lights remained bright. The orchestra had not yet begun playing. The decks were almost level. Nothing around them suggested that the greatest ocean liner ever built was quietly dying beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the crew rushed into action. Stewards knocked on cabin doors one after another, politely waking sleeping families. Engineers continued fighting the flooding below deck while sailors struggled to uncover and prepare the lifeboats. Many crew members had practiced launching boats during drills, but never with more than 2,000 lives depending upon every minute. As passengers slowly gathered on the boat deck, another problem became painfully clear. Very few people wanted to leave the ship. The lifeboats appeared small and fragile compared to the enormous Titanic, standing beside the giant liner. Each wooden boat seemed almost insignificant against towering steel walls. Passengers looked down toward the dark Atlantic hundreds of feet below. The ocean appeared terrifying. The Titanic appeared safe. Many reasoned that staying aboard the warm, brightly lit ship made far more sense than climbing into a tiny open boat floating on freezing black water. Some even refused outright. Married couples argued quietly. Parents hesitated. Friends insisted there was no real danger. After all, how could a ship advertised around the world as nearly unsinkable disappear beneath the sea? It simply did not seem possible. The officers faced an almost unbelievable challenge. Instead of forcing frightened crowds away from danger, they were trying to persuade people to leave apparent safety. Following long-established maritime tradition, the order was given, women and children first. The meaning of those words varied somewhat depending on the officer supervising each lifeboat, but the intention remained clear. Women and children would receive priority whenever possible. The first lifeboat was lowered, then another. To the frustration of several officers, many seats remained empty. Lifeboat number 7, the first successfully launched from the starboard side, carried only around 28 people, despite having room for approximately 65. More than half its capacity remained unused. Officers called for more passengers. Few stepped forward. Another boat left with dozens of empty seats. Then another. Every vacant place represented someone who might later desperately wish they had climbed aboard. At the time, however, no one believed those empty seats would matter. Passengers standing on deck even waved cheerfully to those already lowering toward the water. Some laughed. Some promised they would meet again in New York. Others assumed the boats were simply temporary precautions until another ship arrived. The atmosphere remained surprisingly orderly. Yet beneath that calm surface, invisible tension continued to grow. Thomas Andrews walked quietly through the ship, encouraging passengers to put on life jackets and head toward the lifeboats without delay. Gowan was the proud designer who had admired every polished corridor only days earlier. Now he moved with increasing urgency, fully aware that every passing minute meant less time for escape. Captain Smith crossed the bridge almost silently. Witnesses later described him as deeply troubled, burdened by the impossible responsibility resting upon his shoulders. Every decision affected hundreds of lives, yet no decision could change the ship's fate. Far below, the flooding continued relentlessly. One compartment after another disappeared beneath icy seawater. The bow settled lower. The angle became slightly more noticeable. Most passengers still failed to recognize it, but experienced sailors did. Crew members moving through the lower decks no longer walked across dry floors. Water now surged through passages that had been perfectly safe only minutes before. Boiler room workers retreated step by step as freezing seawater claimed their stations. Pumps continued running, but everyone involved understood they were merely delaying the inevitable. Then another troubling sign appeared. The deck no longer felt perfectly level. It was almost impossible for ordinary passengers to notice. but officers who knew the ship intimately could sense the gradual change. Objects began rolling ever so slightly across polished floors. Water pooled where it never had before. The Titanic was slowly lowering her bow into the Atlantic. More passengers finally began asking serious questions. Is something wrong? Why are the boats leaving? Should we be worried? Stewards answered as calmly as they could, but uncertainty spread from one conversation to another. The orchestra quietly assembled once again. Their instruments would soon provide comfort in a night increasingly filled with fear. The first lifeboats were already drifting away into the darkness, carrying far fewer people than they could have saved. Above them, hundreds still remained aboard the great ship, watching from illuminated decks with quiet curiosity rather than desperation. They did not yet realize that every empty seat disappearing into the freezing Atlantic represented a chance that would never return. The orderly evacuation had begun, but with every passing minute, order was slipping away. Soon the calm confidence that had defined Titanic's entire voyage would give way to confusion, heartbreak, and a desperate struggle against time itself. As the minutes slipped away, the atmosphere aboard Titanic changed forever. The calm confidence that had filled the ship only an hour earlier was slowly giving way to fear. More lifeboats disappeared into the darkness. The bow settled lower into the icy Atlantic, and the list of the ship became increasingly noticeable. At last, even the most optimistic passengers could no longer deny the truth. The Titanic was sinking. Yet amid the growing chaos, extraordinary acts of courage began to unfold. Some people chose not to think about saving themselves. Instead, they thought only of saving others. One of the most unforgettable stories belonged to the ship's 8 musicians, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley. As passengers gathered nervously on the boat deck, the musicians quietly unpacked their instruments. No officer ordered them to play. No rule required them to remain. They stayed because they believed music could calm frightened hearts. Soft melodies drifted through the freezing night. At first, the orchestra performed cheerful waltzes and familiar popular songs, hoping to reassure the passengers waiting for the lifeboats. The sound of violins floated across the deck, blending with the cold wind and the distant creaking of steel. For a few precious moments, children stopped crying, couples held each other's hands, people waiting in line found comfort in music instead of panic. Witnesses later remembered how remarkable the scene was, the great ship slowly dying beneath the stars, and an orchestra continuing to play as though the evening concert had never ended. Exactly what their final piece was remains one of history's greatest maritime mysteries. Many survivors later believed the musicians ended with the hymn Nera, My God, to Thee, while others remembered different melodies. Historians continue to debate the final song. What is beyond dispute is this: not one of the 8 musicians survived. They remained at their posts until the very end, choosing to bring courage to strangers instead of seeking safety for themselves. Elsewhere aboard the ship, another quiet heroism unfolded beyond the view of nearly every passenger. Deep inside the engine and boiler rooms, the engineering crew continued fighting an impossible battle. The flooding had already claimed several forward compartments, but the engineers refused to abandon their stations. Massive generators continued producing electricity, allowing lights throughout the ship to remain on. Pumps continued operating, slowing the flooding as much as possible. Steam pressure was carefully maintained so electrical systems, wireless equipment, and essential machinery would continue functioning. Every extra minute mattered. Without electricity, the ship would have been plunged into darkness. Without power, the wireless operators could not continue sending desperate distress calls. Without working pumps, the flooding would have progressed even faster. The engineers understood exactly what remaining below deck meant. Every passing minute reduced their own chances of escape. Still they stayed. More than 30 engineers and engine room officers, together with many firemen and trimmers, continued their work while freezing seawater slowly invaded the machinery spaces around them. Most would never emerge. Their sacrifice gave hundreds of passengers precious additional time to board the remaining lifeboats. Above them, Captain Edward Smith moved quietly across the boat deck. Only hours earlier, he had stood proudly on the bridge commanding the newest and greatest ship in the White Star Fleet. Now he carried the unbearable responsibility of leading a doomed vessel through its final moments. Witness accounts describe him helping oversee the evacuation, encouraging women and children toward the lifeboats, and checking repeatedly that every possible effort was being made to save lives. As the situation worsened, Smith reportedly released his crew from further obligations. "You have done your duty," he is believed to have told them. "Now every man for himself." It was not surrender. It was recognition that the battle for the ship had already been lost. The captain himself would never leave Titanic. His exact final moments remain uncertain. Some witnesses believe they saw him on the bridge as water swept across it. Others claimed he entered the sea while attempting to help passengers. What is certain is that Captain Edward Smith did not survive. Nearby walked Thomas Andrews, the man who had designed Titanic. Those who encountered him during the final hour remembered his remarkable composure. Rather than searching for a place in a lifeboat, Andrews devoted his remaining time to helping others. He knocked on cabin doors, urging hesitant passengers to put on life jackets. He directed families toward the boat deck, and encouraged women who still refused to leave the warmth of the ship. Several survivors later recalled seeing him helping strangers, never mentioning his own safety. One witness remembered Andrews standing quietly in the first-class smoking room during the final minutes, gazing at a painting above the fireplace, as though reflecting upon the magnificent ship he had spent years creating. Whether that account is completely accurate or not, one truth remains undeniable. Thomas Andrews never attempted to save himself. He went down with the ship he had dreamed into existence. Throughout Titanic, similar acts of quiet bravery unfolded without applause or recognition. Stewards carried frightened children toward lifeboats before searching for their own families. Crew members returned again and again into flooding corridors to wake sleeping passengers. Sailors struggled with frozen ropes while refusing places in the boats they launched. Husbands embraced wives, promising they would meet again, even when they knew the promise could never be kept. Fathers lifted children into lifeboats with trembling smiles, hiding their fear until the boats disappeared into the darkness. No headlines would record every name. No monument could tell every story. Yet together these ordinary men and women transformed one of history's greatest disasters into one of its greatest examples of human courage. The orchestra continued playing. The engineers continued working. The captain continued leading. And countless others continued choosing the lives of strangers over their own. The Atlantic would soon claim the Titanic. But before it did, it revealed something far greater than the strength of steel. It revealed the extraordinary strength of the human spirit when faced with the certainty of the end. By 12 o'clock after midnight, the truth could no longer be hidden. The bow of the Titanic had settled noticeably deeper into the freezing Atlantic, and seawater was steadily creeping farther onto the forward decks. Lifeboats continued to leave the ship, but time was running out. Every passing minute made launching them more difficult, as the growing angle of the deck complicated every movement. The Atlantic remained strangely calm. There were no crashing waves, no thunder, no violent storm. Only the bitter wind, the endless stars overhead, and the quiet certainty that one of the greatest ships ever built was slowly dying. Around 12:30, passengers who had once questioned the evacuation now hurried toward the remaining lifeboats. The calm order that had defined the early stages of the rescue was beginning to unravel. Families searched desperately for one another. Crew members shouted instructions above the growing noise. Lifeboats were lowered one after another into the black water below, disappearing into the darkness with lanterns swaying gently against the night. Far beneath the decks, engineers continued fighting a battle they knew they could not win. Boiler rooms disappeared beneath icy seawater one by one. The roar of machinery slowly gave way to the relentless sound of flooding. Still, the generators continued producing electricity. Still, the lights remained on. Every extra minute brought another chance for someone above. By 1 o'clock, the bow had dropped even lower. Passengers walking toward the stern could now feel the ship's unmistakable slope beneath their feet. Deck chairs slid slowly across polished wooden planks. Loose objects rolled along corridors. Water washed over the forward well deck, where only hours earlier curious passengers had played with pieces of iceberg ice. The sea was claiming the ship deck by deck. On the boat deck, officers worked frantically to launch the final lifeboats. There were no longer enough seats. The terrible arithmetic had become reality. Hundreds remained aboard with no escape. Distress rockets continued climbing into the sky, exploding into brilliant white stars above the Atlantic before fading once more into darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another ship might see them. Somewhere, but not close enough. Around 1:30, panic finally spread across sections of the ship. People who had delayed now rushed desperately toward the remaining boats. Some cried out for missing family members. Others stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Stewards continued helping women and children through the crowds while officers struggled to maintain order with calm voices and unwavering discipline. Meanwhile, the orchestra still played. Their music drifted softly across the freezing air, almost surreal against the sounds of steam escaping from the funnels and the growing roar of the sea below. By 2 o'clock, nearly every lifeboat had gone. Only collapsible boats remained, hastily prepared while water continued rising. The bow was now deeply submerged, the stern lifted higher into the night sky. Inside the ship, gravity transformed familiar corridors into steep passageways. Furniture broke loose, glass shattered. Heavy objects crashed through luxurious rooms that only hours earlier had hosted elegant conversations and fine dinners. Thousands of tons of freezing seawater surged through the interior with unstoppable force. Then came another terrifying sound. A deep metallic groan echoed through the ship. Passengers later described it as unlike anything they had ever heard. It was the sound of steel under impossible strain. The hull, designed to carry enormous weight evenly across calm water, was now supported almost entirely by the still floating stern while the flooded bow pulled relentlessly downward. The forces became overwhelming. At approximately 2:17, the ship's electrical generators finally failed. Without warning, every light aboard Titanic went dark. The glowing floating palace that had illuminated the Atlantic for days vanished instantly into complete blackness. Gasps echoed across the decks. Only the stars remained. Moments later, another thunderous roar rolled through the night as the stern continued rising. Passengers clung to railings, ropes, and one another while the deck tilted ever steeper beneath their feet. Some prayed. Some called the names of loved ones. Others simply stared into the darkness ahead. Then came the moment no one aboard could ever have imagined. The immense stresses acting upon the ship reached their limit. With a deafening crack that echoed across the silent ocean, Titanic broke apart. The forward section, already filled with water, separated and plunged rapidly toward the ocean floor. For a brief moment, the stern settled back before rising almost vertically into the freezing night, its enormous propellers exposed high above the sea for the first and only time. Witnesses in the lifeboats watched in stunned silence. The impossible was unfolding before their eyes. The greatest ship ever built stood upright against the stars. Then gravity took over. The stern slowly tipped forward. Water rushed every remaining opening. The final section disappeared beneath the surface. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, just 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg, the Titanic vanished beneath the North Atlantic. The sea closed over her. Silence followed. The lights were gone. The music was gone. The mighty engines were silent forever. Only hundreds of people remained scattered across the freezing black water, their voices rising into the darkness as the lifeboats drifted helplessly nearby. Far below, the two broken halves of the Titanic began their lonely descent through nearly 4,000 meters of ocean, carrying with them grand staircases, elegant dining rooms, handwritten letters, unopened luggage, and thousands of dreams that would never reach America. The voyage that had begun with cheers in Southampton ended beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. The ship that the world believed could never sink had disappeared. But the story of that night was far from over. For those who survived would soon face another battle, won not against or ice, but against the merciless cold of the open sea. 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. For a brief moment, the ocean seemed almost peaceful again. The towering funnels were gone. The lights had vanished. The roar of machinery had fallen silent forever. Then came a sound that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The cries. Hundreds of voices rose from the freezing black water, calling for help in every direction. Some shouted the names of husbands, wives, or children. Others pleaded for anyone to throw them a rope or turn back with a lifeboat. Many simply cried out again and again into the darkness, hoping anyone could hear them. Those haunting voices carried across the calm sea with astonishing clarity. There were no engines to drown them out, no wind to scatter them, only the vast silence of the North Atlantic. The water surrounding Titanic was only about -2 degrees Celsius, cold enough for seawater to remain liquid because of its salt content. To anyone entering it, the shock was immediate. The cold stole the breath from their lungs. Muscles tightened without warning. The body instinctively gasped, making it difficult to breathe calmly. Even the strongest swimmers struggled to keep control. Many passengers had survived the sinking itself. Their greatest enemy had become something invisible: the temperature. Within minutes, the freezing water began drawing heat from the human body at an astonishing rate. Hands became numb. Fingers refused to move. Arms and legs grew heavier with every passing moment. Simple movements that had seemed effortless only seconds earlier became exhausting. People tried desperately to swim toward nearby lifeboats. Some clung to floating pieces of wreckage. Others held tightly to one another, believing they could somehow stay warm together. But the Atlantic showed no mercy. As body temperature continued to fall, confusion replaced determination. Voices became weaker. Movements slowed. Some people simply stopped struggling, no longer able to fight the overwhelming cold. One by one, the cries across the water began to fade. Inside the lifeboats, the survivors faced an impossible choice. They had escaped the sinking, But now they floated in darkness, listening to hundreds of desperate voices surrounding them. Many lifeboats were already close to their safe carrying capacity. Some officers feared that if they returned immediately, panicked swimmers might overwhelm the boats, causing them to capsize and sending everyone into the freezing sea. Others believed they should turn back despite the danger. The debate lasted only minutes. Yet those minutes changed countless lives. Most lifeboats continued drifting away from the cries. The people inside covered their ears. Some wept openly. Others stared silently into the darkness, unable to look toward the voices calling for help. Parents held children close, trying to shield them from the terrible sounds echoing across the water. No decision that night came without heartbreak. One of the few exceptions was Fifth Officer Harold Lowe. After organizing passengers and redistributing people among several lifeboats to create additional space, Lowe made the courageous decision to return toward the wreck site. By then, precious time had already passed. The cries had grown fewer. The freezing Atlantic had already claimed most of those still in the water. When Lowe's boat finally reached the area, only a handful of people remained alive. They pulled as many survivors aboard as they could, but the vast majority had already succumbed to the cold. The silence that followed was perhaps even more terrifying than the cries themselves. Where hundreds of voices had filled the night only minutes before, almost nothing remained. The Atlantic had become quiet once again. For the survivors sitting inside the lifeboats, that silence would never leave them. Many later admitted that they could still hear those voices decades after the disaster. Some suffered nightmares for the rest of their lives. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering whether more people could have been saved if the boats had returned sooner. Historians have asked that same question for more than a century. Why were so few rescued after the ship disappeared? The answer lies in a tragic combination of circumstances. The water was lethally cold. Most victims lost the ability to move within a very short time. Darkness made it nearly impossible to locate individuals in the open sea. The lifeboats were scattered over a wide area, and many officers feared being overwhelmed by large numbers of desperate swimmers. By the time several boats considered returning, the window for rescue had almost closed. It was not the sinking alone that claimed so many lives. It was the cold. The iceberg had wounded the ship. The Atlantic finished what the iceberg had begun. As the survivors drifted beneath a sky filled with stars, they wrapped blankets around trembling shoulders and watched the empty horizon, hoping another ship might appear before dawn. Hours seemed to pass without end. Bitter wind continued to blow. Children cried softly in their mothers' arms. Some survivors whispered prayers. Others sat in complete silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Behind them, nearly 4,000 meters below the surface, Titanic rested in darkness. Above, the ocean revealed no trace of the magnificent vessel that had carried more than 2,000 dreams across the Atlantic only days before. Only scattered lifeboats remained, floating upon a sea that looked as calm and peaceful as it had had before the disaster began. It was a heartbreaking reminder of one of history's cruelest truths. The greatest danger that night was not the iceberg, it was the freezing ocean that waited beneath it. And as the first pale light of dawn slowly approached the eastern horizon, the survivors realized they had escaped the sinking, only to face one final test, before rescue would finally arrive. At 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic was gone. Where the greatest ocean liner ever built had floated only moments before, there was now nothing but a vast field of floating wreckage scattered across the freezing Atlantic. Lifeboats drifted silently beneath a sky beginning to fade toward dawn. carrying hundreds of exhausted survivors wrapped in blankets and overcome with shock. Some stared at the empty ocean where the ship had disappeared. Others could not stop crying. Many simply sat in silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Behind them, the last desperate cries from the water had faded away. The Atlantic had become quiet once more, but nearly 90 kilometers away, another ship was racing through the darkness. The RMS Carpathia, a passenger liner of the Cunard Line, had received Titanic's desperate wireless distress calls shortly after midnight. Its wireless operator, Harold Cottam, had been preparing to end his shift when he happened to hear a message unlike any he had ever received. Titanic was calling for help. The world's largest ship was sinking. The message reached Captain Arthur Rostron, who reacted without hesitation. There was no lengthy discussion, no uncertainty, only action. Rostron immediately ordered Carpathia to turn toward Titanic's reported position. Every available ounce of speed would be needed. The engines were pushed to their limits. Extra steam was directed toward the boilers. Heating and hot water throughout much of the ship were reduced, so that every possible bit of power could be sent to the engines. Crew members later recalled that Carpathia seemed to surge forward with determination they had never experienced before. She was built to travel at around 14 knots. That night, Captain Rostron demanded everything the ship could safely deliver. The irony was heartbreaking. To reach Titanic as quickly as possible, Carpathia herself had to navigate through the same dangerous ice field that had destroyed the great liner. Lookouts scanned the darkness constantly. Icebergs loomed silently from the sea. Growlers and drifting ice floated across the route. At any moment Carpathia could have suffered the same fate. Still, Rostron refused to slow unless absolutely necessary. Every minute mattered. Every minute might mean another life saved. While Carpathia raced northward, her crew prepared for what they expected to find. Blankets were gathered. Hot soup and coffee were prepared. Doctors organized medical supplies. Extra cabins were made ready. Passengers aboard Carpathia voluntarily gave up beds, clothing, and personal belongings for people they had never met. No one knew exactly how many survivors remained. No one even knew whether Titanic was still afloat. Then, shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning, the first signs appeared. Not the Titanic. She was already gone. Instead, lookouts spotted small lights flickering across the dark sea. Lifeboats, one after another. Tiny wooden boats scattered across the Atlantic. As dawn slowly illuminated the eastern horizon, the full scale of the disaster became visible. Floating wreckage stretched for miles. Broken deck chairs, pieces of timber, lifebelts, personal belongings. The ocean itself seemed to tell the story of what had happened. Soon, the first lifeboat reached Carpathia. Exhausted survivors were carefully lifted aboard. Many were too weak to climb the rope ladders without assistance. Some collapsed the moment they reached the deck. Others searched desperately through the growing crowd, hoping to find missing husbands, wives, children, parents, or friends. Again and again, the same heartbreaking question echoed across the ship. "Have you seen my family?" Often, no answer came. Women waited anxiously for husbands who would never arrive. Children searched unfamiliar faces for fathers lost forever beneath the Atlantic. Crew members wrapped survivors in warm blankets while doctors treated frostbite, exhaustion, and shock. Many survivors could not speak. Some simply stared into space. Others wept uncontrollably. A few remained strangely calm, as though their minds had not yet accepted reality. By the time Carpathia had gathered the last lifeboat, approximately 700 people had survived. More than 1,500 others had been lost. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. As Carpathia turned toward New York, wireless operators began transmitting the news across the Atlantic. At first, confusion spread through newspapers and telegraph offices. Some early reports mistakenly claimed that Titanic had been damaged but safely towed. Others insisted every passenger had survived. Hope briefly outweighed truth. Then confirmation arrived. Titanic had sunk. The world's largest passenger ship had disappeared on her maiden voyage. The news reached New York before Carpathia herself. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices, shipping company headquarters, and the White Star Line pier. Bulletin boards were surrounded by anxious families searching endless lists of names. Every arriving telegram drew fresh waves of hope or despair. People waited through the day and into the night. Some clung desperately to rumors. Others feared the worst long before official lists were released. When Carpathia finally entered New York Harbor, thousands stood silently along the waterfront despite cold rain and gray skies. There were no celebrations, only grief. Survivors stepped ashore carrying little more than the clothes they had been rescued in. Behind every reunion stood another family that received no embrace. Behind every smile stood countless tears. Across Europe and America, newspapers devoted entire front pages to the disaster. The sinking of the Titanic was no longer simply a maritime accident. It had become a global tragedy. People struggled to understand how the greatest triumph of modern engineering could disappear beneath the sea in a single night. Questions filled headlines. Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why had so many ice warnings gone unheeded? Could more lives have been saved? Investigations would search for answers. New international safety laws would transform ocean travel forever. But none of those changes could erase the loss. The RMS Carpathia had answered Titanic's final cry for help with extraordinary courage. She arrived as quickly as any ship possibly could. She rescued everyone who could still be found alive. Yet even her heroic race across the Atlantic could not outrun the cold. When the last survivor stepped onto her deck, the story of Titanic had already entered history. Not simply as the tale of a magnificent ship, but as a timeless reminder that even humanity's greatest achievements remain humbled by the power of nature, the passage of time, and the enduring courage of ordinary people. More than a century has passed since Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic. Yet one question continues to fascinate historians, engineers, and millions of people around the world. Could the disaster have been prevented? It is a simple question. The answer, however, is anything but simple. Looking back with modern knowledge, it is tempting to search for a single mistake, a single decision that doomed the ship. But history rarely works that way. The loss of Titanic was not caused by one error alone. Instead, it was the result of a chain of circumstances, each one making the next more difficult to overcome. The first issue often discussed is speed. On the evening of April 14, 1912, Titanic continued steaming through an area where multiple ships had reported dangerous ice conditions. Modern observers frequently ask why Captain Edward Smith did not simply slow down. Today, reducing speed after receiving repeated iceberg warnings would seem like the obvious choice. But in 1912, maritime practice was different. Large passenger liners often maintained normal speed unless visibility became poor or ice was directly observed ahead. Captains relied on experienced lookouts, favorable weather, and careful navigation. Smith was following a practice that many respected captains of his era considered reasonable. That does not necessarily mean it was the safest decision. With today's understanding, reducing speed would almost certainly have provided more time to detect and avoid an iceberg. Even a modest reduction might have allowed additional seconds to maneuver or lessened the severity of the collision. Another subject surrounded by legend is the missing binoculars. Many people have heard the story that Titanic's lookouts had no binoculars, because the key to the locker containing them had accidentally remained with an officer reassigned before departure. The detail is largely true. The lookouts relied entirely on their own eyesight. However, modern historians point out that binoculars would probably not have transformed the outcome. At night, binoculars actually narrow the field of vision and can make it harder to detect a dark object directly ahead. Experienced lookouts of the period often preferred using the naked eye during nighttime watches. The absence of binoculars has become one of Titanic's most famous stories. It was unfortunate, but it was almost certainly not the decisive reason the iceberg was spotted too late. Another long-debated topic involves the ship's rivets. Titanic's hull was held together by millions of steel and wrought iron rivets. Later examinations of recovered wreckage suggested that some rivets used in certain sections may have been of lower quality than those available today. Under extreme stress, a number of them likely failed, allowing steel plates to separate more easily during the collision. Did weak rivets sink Titanic? Not by themselves. The iceberg struck with tremendous force across a long section of the hull. Even with stronger materials, the impact would still have caused serious damage. Modern engineers generally agree that the rivets may have worsened the flooding, but they were only one factor among many. Then there were the watertight compartments. Ironically, one of Titanic's greatest engineering achievements also revealed one of her greatest weaknesses. The ship had been designed to survive flooding in up to 4 forward compartments. Unfortunately, the iceberg damaged 5. As the bow settled lower into the water, seawater spilled over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartment, creating a devastating chain reaction. Today, passenger ships are designed with much higher watertight standards, but in 1912, Titanic represented the cutting edge of naval engineering. She was not poorly designed. She was designed according to the best knowledge available at the time. Nature simply presented a scenario beyond those design limits. The iceberg itself has also been the subject of endless discussion. Could it have been avoided entirely? Possibly. But several unfortunate conditions combined against the crew that night. The sea was unusually calm, leaving no waves breaking against the base of the iceberg. There was no moon to illuminate the horizon. The night was exceptionally clear, creating a deceptive visual effect, where sea and sky blended together. The iceberg remained almost invisible until the final moments. Perhaps the greatest lesson, however, concerns human decision-making. No one aboard Titanic intended to take unnecessary risks. Captain Smith relied upon accepted maritime practices. The officers responded immediately once the iceberg was spotted. The engineers remained at their posts until the end. The wireless operators worked tirelessly, sending distress calls. Most people aboard performed their duties with remarkable professionalism and courage. Yet history reminds us that disasters often emerge not from one catastrophic mistake, but from many reasonable decisions that together create an unexpected outcome. Another painful reality involved the lifeboats. Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly half the people aboard. To modern audiences, this seems almost unbelievable. However, the ship actually exceeded the minimum legal requirements of the time. Those regulations had been written years earlier, when passenger ships were much smaller. The law had failed to keep pace with rapid advances in shipbuilding. The tragedy exposed that dangerous gap. Within a few years, international maritime rules were completely rewritten. Lifeboats became mandatory for everyone aboard. Regular evacuation drills were introduced. Continuous wireless radio watches became standard practice. International ice patrols began monitoring dangerous iceberg regions to warn ships crossing the North Atlantic. Finally, there are the misunderstandings that survived for more than a century. Many people still believe Titanic was officially advertised as unsinkable. In reality, the ship was generally described as being designed to be as safe as possible, while newspapers and public enthusiasm gradually transformed that confidence into the famous. Another misconception is that a gigantic gash was torn through the hull. Modern surveys of the wreck show that the damage consisted mainly of a series of relatively narrow openings spread across several compartments. Individually, they seemed manageable. Together, they proved fatal. Perhaps the most important lesson of Titanic is not that one person failed, one material broke, or one decision caused disaster. It is that even the greatest achievements of human engineering remain vulnerable when confidence begins to outpace caution. The sinking of Titanic changed maritime history forever because it forced the world to confront a difficult truth. Progress is powerful. Technology is remarkable. But neither can ever replace humility before the forces of nature. And that lesson continues to guide every ship that sails across the Atlantic today. When the Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, she seemed to vanish from the world forever. The exact location of the wreck remained a mystery. Survivors knew only the general area where the ship had gone down, but the Atlantic was unimaginably vast. Beneath the surface lay nearly 4,000 meters of cold, crushing darkness. At that depth, sunlight could never reach. Water pressure exceeded hundreds of times the pressure at sea level, strong enough to crush most ordinary submarines in an instant. For decades, the Titanic rested undisturbed. Storms passed overhead. Ships crossed the Atlantic above her. World wars came and went. Entire generations were born and grew old. Yet beneath the ocean the great liner remained hidden in complete darkness, untouched by human eyes. Many believed she would never be found. Searching for the wreck was like trying to locate a single building in the middle of an enormous continent with no roads, no landmarks, and no light. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, several expeditions attempted to solve the mystery, but the technology simply did not exist. Sonar systems were limited, underwater cameras were primitive, and remotely operated vehicles capable of exploring such extreme depths were still in their infancy. The Atlantic kept it secret. Then, in 1985, everything changed. An expedition led by oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, working alongside a French research team led by Jean-Louis Michel, finally succeeded where so many others had failed. After days of searching across the dark ocean floor, cameras transmitted something extraordinary, not the whole ship. At first, only scattered debris, a boiler, pieces of steel, broken machinery. Then, suddenly, the unmistakable outline of Titanic's bow emerged from the darkness. For the first time in more than 73 years, human eyes looked once again upon the legendary ship. The images were unlike anything the world had imagined. The bow still stood proudly upright, resting silently on the seabed, as though waiting for passengers who would never return. Rust-colored formations known today as rusticles hung from the steel like frozen waterfalls, slowly consuming the once mighty vessel. Marine life had claimed every surface, transforming the ship into an artificial reef deep beneath the Atlantic. The discovery captivated the entire world. Millions watched the haunting footage on television. The Titanic had not disappeared. She had simply been sleeping beneath the sea. As later expeditions explored farther, They revealed scenes that were both fascinating and deeply moving. There were elegant china plates, many still stacked together almost exactly as they had been stored before the voyage. Delicate glass bottles rested undisturbed in the mud. Pieces of fine furniture, decorative lamps, and personal belongings lay scattered across the seabed, silently marking the place where thousands of dreams had come to an end. Among the most emotional discoveries were objects that reminded the world the wreck was not merely an engineering marvel. It was also a grave. One famous image showed a pair of leather shoes lying side by side on the ocean floor. No human remains surrounded them. Over the decades, nature had reclaimed nearly everything else. Yet the shoes remained. They quietly suggested where a passenger had once come to rest more than a century earlier. Nearby, explorers found pocket watches, forever stopped at the moment seawater entered their delicate mechanisms. Some still rested inside rusted cases. Others lay beside fragments of clothing, spectacles, buttons and jewelry. Each object told a story without speaking. A watch had once marked the hours of someone's ordinary life. A teacup had once been lifted during breakfast. A suitcase had once held hopes for a new beginning in America. Now they rested together in eternal silence. Perhaps no image has become more iconic than the bow of the Titanic itself. Its massive anchor still points forward into darkness. The railings, though badly damaged in places, remain recognizable. The famous forecastle deck has become instantly familiar through documentaries, photographs, and deep-sea exploration. Standing before the cameras after more than a century beneath the Atlantic, the bow still carries an astonishing sense of dignity. It is difficult to look at those images without imagining the passengers who once stood there, watching the sunrise during the voyage's first peaceful days. Today, the wreck continues to change. Powerful ocean currents, microscopic bacteria, and corrosion slowly weaken the steel every year. The rusticles consume the ship from within, causing sections to collapse that once appeared stable. Experts believe that, over the coming decades, much of the recognizable structure may gradually disappear, eventually returning to the seabed from which it came. For that reason, modern expeditions balance scientific exploration with respect. The Titanic is more than an archaeological site. It is also the resting place of more than 1,500 people who never came home. Every photograph taken there carries a sense of quiet reverence. Every exploration reminds us that beneath nearly 4,000 meters of icy water lies not only one of history's greatest engineering achievements, but also one of humanity's most enduring stories. The lost giant still rests where the Atlantic claimed her, silent, dark, and forever watching the world sail above. More than a century has passed since the Titanic slipped beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The steel has rusted, the wood has vanished, the once grand interiors have slowly surrendered to the sea, and yet somehow, the Titanic has never truly sunk, not in our memories, not in history, not in the human imagination. Every generation discovers the story anew. Some first encounter it through photographs of the haunting wreck. Others learn about it from books, documentaries, or the famous film that introduced millions to the tragedy. But no matter how people first hear the story, they are often left asking the same question. Why does the Titanic still matter? The answer begins with what happened after the disaster. The sinking did far more than end one voyage. It transformed the future of life at sea. In the months that followed, governments around the world launched detailed investigations into every stage of the tragedy. Experts examined the ship's design, questioned survivors, studied wireless communications, and reviewed maritime regulations that had remained largely unchanged while ships grew bigger and more advanced. The conclusions reshaped international shipping forever. New laws required that passenger ships carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, ending the outdated regulations that had failed to keep pace with modern engineering. Regular lifeboat drills became mandatory, ensuring that both crew members and passengers would know exactly what to do during an emergency. Wireless radio stations were required to maintain continuous 24-hour watches, so that distress calls would never again go unanswered simply because an operator had gone off duty. Perhaps one of the most significant changes was the creation of the International Ice Patrol, which continues to monitor iceberg movements across the North Atlantic today. Using ships, aircraft, satellites, and advanced technology, the patrol helps guide modern vessels safely around dangerous ice fields. Every passenger crossing the Atlantic today benefits from lessons learned on that cold April night. In that sense, Titanic continues to save lives. The tragedy also inspired remarkable advances in shipbuilding. Modern passenger vessels are designed with stronger hulls, improved watertight compartment systems, advanced navigation equipment, satellite communications, computerized weather forecasting, and emergency procedures that engineers in 1912 could scarcely have imagined. Technology evolved because the world refused to forget. Yet Titanic's legacy reaches far beyond engineering. The ship became part of global culture in a way that very few historical events ever have. Novelists, historians, musicians, artists, and filmmakers have returned to the story again and again, each searching for new ways to understand what happened. But the reason people continue telling the story is not simply because a great ship sank. It is because of the people aboard. Behind every cabin number was a human life, a child dreaming of America, a wealthy businessman planning his future, a young couple beginning married life, a musician carrying his violin, an engineer trusting the machines he helped maintain, a mother holding her children close. Their hopes were different, their backgrounds were different, yet when disaster struck, they all faced the same unforgiving ocean. Even today, historians continue uncovering forgotten diaries, family letters, photographs, and personal stories that add new pieces to the Titanic's history. Some names that once appeared only on passenger lists have gradually become real people again. Their voices, preserved in handwritten letters and survivor testimonies, continue speaking across generations. That may be why the story never grows old. It is not only about the past, it is about ourselves. Titanic also reminds us of something both inspiring and uncomfortable. Human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements. We can build machines that cross oceans. We can connect continents. We can transform impossible dreams into reality. But we can also become overconfident. The early 20th century was an age of remarkable technological optimism. Many believed science and engineering could overcome nearly every obstacle nature presented. Titanic represented that confidence. She was magnificent. She was innovative. She was the pride of an industrial civilization convinced that the future belonged entirely to human ingenuity. Then, in a single night, the Atlantic offered a humbling reminder. Nature does not negotiate. It does not recognize wealth. It does not distinguish between first class and third class. It does not care about reputation, status, or ambition. Before the sea, every human life is equally fragile. Yet if the disaster exposed humanity's vulnerability, it also revealed humanity's greatest strength. The musicians who continued playing, the engineers who remained at their posts, the crew members who guided strangers into lifeboats, the parents who chose their children's lives before their own, the rescuers aboard Carpathia who raced through dangerous ice to answer a desperate call for help. These acts of courage have become just as important as the tragedy itself. Steel eventually rusts. Ships eventually disappear. But compassion, sacrifice, and bravery endure. Perhaps that is why Titanic still moves millions of people more than 100 years later. It is not remembered simply because it was the largest ship of its time. It is remembered because it tells one of history's most deeply human stories, a story of extraordinary ambition, a story of heartbreaking loss, a story of impossible choices, a story of ordinary people revealing extraordinary courage when faced with the unimaginable. The wreck still rests nearly 4,000 meters beneath the Atlantic. Slowly, by year, the ocean continues reclaiming it. One day the famous bow may finally collapse. The steel may disappear. The last visible traces of the ship may fade into the sea forever. But the Titanic itself will never truly vanish, because it no longer belongs only to the ocean. It belongs to history. It belongs to memory. And it belongs to every generation willing to remember that progress should always be guided by humility, that courage often appears in the darkest moments, and that even the greatest achievements of humanity remain beautifully and profoundly fragile before the power of nature. As our journey comes to an end, let us return one final time to the floor of the North Atlantic, nearly 4,000 meters beneath the surface, where sunlight has never reached and silence has ruled for more than a century. The Titanic still rests. The camera glides slowly toward her famous bow, now covered in rust, coral-like rusticles, and delicate marine life. Fish drift quietly through broken railings, while the once wrecks have become part of the ocean itself. Here time seems to stand still. It is difficult to believe that this peaceful place was once filled with laughter, music, hope, and the excitement of a new beginning. The Titanic was never just a ship. She was a symbol of an age that believed anything was possible. She carried dreams of a better future, families searching for new lives, innovators who believed in human progress, and ordinary people whose stories would become extraordinary through tragedy. On that cold April night, the Atlantic claimed more than steel and machinery. It claimed thousands of hopes, forever changing countless families and leaving a mark that reshaped maritime safety for generations to come. Yet from unimaginable loss came lasting lessons. Safer ships, stronger international laws, continuous radio watches, better emergency procedures, and countless improvements in navigation, all grew from the sacrifices made that night. The legacy of Titanic is measured not only by the lives that were lost, but also by the millions of lives that have been protected ever since. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most unforgettable stories. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration of the past, don't forget to follow the channel and subscribe so you won't miss our next voyage into history. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Which historical story should we explore together next? As we leave the Atlantic behind, remember these words: the ocean claimed the ship, but history kept her alive. More than a century later, Titanic still sails not across the Atlantic, but through our memories.